Hello and welcome to Chapter 8 of Greek for the Rest of Us. Today we will be looking at Greek verbs, specifically looking at the indicative verbs. So last time we looked at English verbs, today we're going to be looking at the Greek. So first, inflection. Again, inflection looking at changes in form for the sake of meaning. So the first thing we're going to see is that there are going to be agreement. There's going to be agreement between a Greek verb and its subject, and that agreement is going to be in person and in number. So whether it's first, second, or third person, or whether it's singular or plural, there's going to be an agreement between the subjects. So where you have a plural subject, you're going to see a plural verb. All right, and how does this happen in Greek? When it comes to the verbs, there's personal endings. So the Greek verbs indicate their person and number by adding different suffixes to the end of the word. That is seen here in 8.3. This is called a paradigm. You do not need to memorize. Do not memorize. Say yet. This is ultimately valuable if you're going to be able to just sight read and sit down and read a Greek New Testament. But for the purpose of this class in Greek for the Rest of Us that's primarily dealing with tools, this is information that you can access within Logos. So if you have Greek paradigm in front of you, you can see right along the side here, this side is the stem. We're going to talk about that in a second when we talk about morphology. But then over here, we have the personal endings. And within those personal endings, you have the information needed to determine, is this first person, is this third person, is this plural, is it singular? So you have akuo, would be I hear, akues, you hear, akue, he, she, it hears, akuomen, we hear, akuete, you hear, and then be plural, plural you, so you could say y'all hear, and then akusi would be they here. So this is getting into something called morphology, which we're not going to go in depth in, but morphology is the study of how a language uses small pieces of information called morphemes to construct words. So a morpheme, is the smallest meaning-containing components of a word. So an example of this in English, when we talk about English morphology, we have the word Bibles here. And this word, one word, actually contains two morphemes. We have Bible, that's giving us information about what are we talking about, but then we also have the ending, the suffix s, and that's telling me that we're talking about plural Bibles. Sometimes we have this in the beginning of words like righteous, and then we also have unrighteous, or we have unrighteousness, that where we have the morpheme un, we have right, we have yus, talking about this more of an idea of rightness, and then we have righteousness, whereas, again, another morpheme on the end there. So these things build together, and this is called morphology. The stem of a word is called, is one of those morphemes, and the stem, in the case here of like akuete, the stem carries the basic meaning of the word. And then personal ending is also a morpheme, telling me how it's functioning in the sentence and how to translate it. We're going to touch more on morphology when we get to chapter 25. You don't have to master this. You don't have to fully understand this for the sake of this course, but it's valuable to know what's going on and understand just what goes into that so you can realize how these translation decisions are made and what sort of data someone's drawing off of. Just regarding parsing, 8.4, Logos will parse that verbal information for you. So if you encounter a word, you just hold over it in Logos and let it tell you what's the person, what's the number, what's the tense, what's the voice, what's the mood, what's the lexical form. And then another thing for your homework, you're going to need to provide those 6 things, but also meaning in context. So what's a short, concise translation of this word based on the context? All right, next we're going to look at grammar. And as we think about Greek verb grammar, first thing to note is that the nominative subjects, the nouns, will generally be the subjects of the verb. So in the example here, Christos, Iesus, Eilthen, eis ton kosmon, hamartolus, sosai. Here we have, Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, or sinners to save. Christos Iesus is in the nominative, which means in this case it is functioning as the subject. And then we have Eilthen, which is the verb. So it's right to see that Christ Jesus came. Christ Jesus is the subject of that verb. All right, also accusatives. When we think about accusatives and their relationship to the to the verb, generally for direct objects, they're going to be in the accusative case. So that's how they're going to be linked to the verb. It's not going to be word order. Again, not word order. So you might have a direct object showing up before the verb, after the verb, significantly after the verb, but again, you're looking for those case endings. And in the case of using Greek study tools like Logos or Accordance, you're going to be looking for that to be highlighted for you within that software. Also, something that's really important, unexpressed subjects. So in English, we really need to have subjects in most cases. However, in Greek, much like Spanish or French, because of the inflection of the verbs and those personal endings, and the fact that that's actually already indicating person and number, Greek often does not include an explicit subject because that's already bound up in the verb itself. So, for example, if I encounter akuo, I know, without having to see ego, I know that the translation for that is I here. Now, if you encounter because of this idea of an unexpressed subject, if I encounter something like ego, akuo, if I encounter something like ego akuo, I know that this is already telling me everything I need to know, which means this, ego, is functioning as bonus material, really. And in that case, it may be valuable to translate this as something like I myself here. Really just drawing out that idea of like, me. I'm really talking about me right now. I myself have heard. I myself hear. So that's the idea of an unexpressed subject. And that's one exegetical implication, is that where there's no need for a subject, in the case of akuo, for example, where you see a subject in the nominative case show up, it should clue you into, okay, something significant's happening there. The author is drawing emphasis for a reason. Next thing is lexical form, 8.9. The lexical form of a verb is going to be the first person singular present indicative. So again, looking back at our little paradigm over here, if I were to encounter a word like akue and try to look it up in the lexicon, I wouldn't find it. I'd have to go and see what is the first person singular present indicative. So that's the lexical form. All right, we come now to the idea of aspect in the Greek, and this is really critical. This is a very important aspect, no pun intended, of Greek to understand. At the heart of the Greek verbal system is not so much telling the reader when something happens, but rather what kind of action occurs. So in English, very much our language has a focus on, is this a past thing? Is it a present thing? Is it a future thing? Greek can communicate that, but the bigger focus is it a happening action? Is it a happened action? Or is it a happened with ongoing implications action? Is it finished? Is it happening? What kind of action are we talking about here? So the three aspects are undefined, continuous and perfective. The undefined or perfective aspect tells us nothing about the kind of action. The continuous or imperfective aspect describes the action as ongoing. This idea of imperfectivism is not brought to perfection, it's not brought to completion. And then we have the perfective or combinative aspect, and that describes an action that was brought to completion. And hence it is in the past, but it has effects felt in the speaker's present. So something that happened, finished, and there's implications going forward. So those are the aspects, but the aspects only come out and are able to be seen through the tenses. And the Greek tenses carry two connotations, both aspect and time. So you're going to see the three aspects, but all three aspects are going to be kind of buried within the tense, as it were, and parallel to that time. So there are 5 tenses in Greek, and the key is to remember the combination of time and aspect conveyed by each case. So we have the tenses right here. And those tenses are present, future, aorist, imperfect, and perfect. And then we have the time when these things occurred and the aspect. Again, this is kind of caveat here. This is normally. There are some significant deviations from this that we'll get into later. So in the present tense, we're talking present time. It happens now. And the aspect is continuous. You could kind of have that ing idea. It's happening. And then we have future. Future is something that is later. And it is undefined. It's not commenting. It's not giving us information on whether or not this is something that's done, or whether or not this is something that is, something that will be completed, finished, or something that will be ongoing. So it's undefined. And then we have aorist, which is time in the past, but it's undefined as to whether or not it's a completed event or whether it is something that was happening. So it's not completely defined there. It is happening in the past or happened in the past. Then we have the imperfect. This is also past time, and it's communicating continuous idea. So again, that ing, we were going to Galilee. And then we have lastly the idea of the perfect tense, which is completed, and then its effects are felt in the present. And it is the perfective, undefined, or continuous aspect. All right, so a little bit about the present indicative. The present indicative describes an action that generally occurs in the present. So it makes sense because the tense is present tense, and then the mood is indicative. It's something that is happening or happens in the present. This verse here, tenes de kai di eudokian ton Christon kairususin. Some, but indeed, through goodwill, the Christ preach, or some preach Christ, indeed, through goodwill. This tenes, by the way, is nominative, so this is the subject. And we have kairususin. It's just commenting on the fact that this is happening, or it happens. And this comes out in translation, which we'll look at over on the other page here. Some indeed preach Christ from goodwill, or the NASB, really bringing out that continuous idea. Some are preaching Christ from goodwill. So that's the present indicative. We'll also see the future indicative. And this is going to be, in general, and these are summaries, this is going to be predictive. So the future indicative describes an action that will occur in the future. and this is the idea of will fall away or will depart on the aposteisontai verb there. And then we have two past tenses. This is important as we think through the fact that it's not simply a one past tense like what we have in English. In English, there are two past tenses, the aorist and the imperfect. Greek has two tenses that indicate past time, and the difference between the two is their aspect. So aorist, as you'll remember from our previous page, aorist tense describes an undefined action that normally occurs in the past. So it's not defined whether it's continuous or whether it's completed. Whereas the imperfect tense describes a continuous action that normally occurs in the past. Now, the aorist is the default past tense, which means if an author uses the imperfect, the question then becomes why? Why did they use the imperfect if the aorist is default and both communicate past time? Well, it's because the difference generally is what's being highlighted. It's a continuous action. It's a continuous action. So if an author chooses to use an imperfect rather than aorist, it's usually going to be emphasizing that ongoing element of what was happening. All right, and the perfect indicative. The perfect indicative, Greek perfect, describes an action that was brought to completion. It was brought to completion, but the effects are felt in the present. Okay, the idea of it was brought to completion. And this is the past over here. And then the present is the effects felt into the perspective of the speaker. So something that was brought to completion, it happened. And again, I drew this as a kind of extended period here, which that implies that it was continuous, but it's actually, because the aspect is perfective, it's undefined and continuous. So we don't actually know, is it continuous or is it momentary, because it's not always defined. So that's the perfect indicative. All right, we come now to the topic of voice. And there are three voices in Greek. Those are the active, the passive, and the middle. So the active voice means the subject does the action of the verb. So you have subject doing the verb. And this is seen in Christos Iesus Elthen. We already looked at that earlier. Christ Jesus came. He's the subject. He is doing the verb. He's doing the coming. And then what about the passive voice? The passive voice means the subject receives the action of the verb. So in this case, you have verb and subject is actually being acted on. Now, in the middle voice, which is another one, the third voice in Greek, in the middle voice, it means the subject still does the action of the verb, but in some way, the subject is emphasized in the action of the verb. The technical name for this is subject affectedness. The subject is affected by the verb. So you can diagram this way. It's kind of the verb's happening, but in some way, and that's more of a reflexive idea. But you also just have it in general. It's subject still doing the verb, but the subject is really an emphasis. And then Mounds talks in 8.3 on the idea of reflexiveness, which is what we highlighted up above here. There's a few cases where the middle approaches the idea of a reflexive construction. So the idea of he hanged himself, where it's clear that the subject is what's being acted on by itself grammatically. All right, the indicative mood. Just briefly, this is what the whole chapter's about. The indicative mood is the mood that describes something that is, rather than something that might be or ought to be. So, elethean, lego, u, pseudomai is I am speaking the truth. I am not lying. Not a might be or a may be like the subjunctive. I might be speaking the truth, or may I speak the truth. And it's not a command or an imperative. You ought to speak the truth, or speak the truth. It is just simply telling what is. I am speaking the truth, or I speak the truth. So that's the indicative mood. And then Greek word order. One thing just to be aware of is that postpositives are words that cannot occur as the first word in the Greek clause. We've learned a few of them already. De, gar, un. You're not going to see those as the first word in the Greek clause. So, like de, un, it is necessary, therefore, ton, episkopon. In this case, generally, therefore, is going to move to the beginning when we're translating it into English. All right, now vocabulary, our vocab for chapter 8. Lego, I say or I tell. Laleo, I speak. Apokrinomai, I answer. Erkomai, I come. Eis erkomai, I come into, or I enter. This is an idea of a compound word here. You can see the connection between erkomai and eis erkomai quite clearly. But that eis tacked onto the beginning makes it I come into or I enter. And then same for exerkomai, which is our next one. Exerkomai, I come out. Horao, I see. Akuo, I hear, I understand, I obey. Eimi, I am, or he is, or we are, or he was. All of these are going to be entailed in this idea of eimi. And ginomai, I become, or I am. All right, that is your vocab for chapter 8.